Hey everyone, Professor Lamar here, and welcome to our first mini lecture. Here in this mini lecture, we're going to talk about the methods of knowing, which is found in chapter 1 of your textbook. So let's go ahead and get started. You see, as discussed in chapter 1, there are 5 different ways that we come to learn and acquire information. And those 5 ways of knowing are called intuition, authority, rationalism, empiricism, and the scientific method. Now, hopefully we've heard of some of these. Like, for instance, have you heard of the word intuition? Probably. And what does it mean? Also, authority might be a bit familiar. Think about what authority means to you. And then also, maybe you've also heard of rationalism, empiricism, and the scientific method. Now, what we're going to do is take each one of these 5 ways of knowing, explain what it means, and go through an example. So let's start with intuition. Intuition is basically like a gut feeling that we have about something. And it's using those gut feelings or emotions to make our decisions and derive at some sort of like piece of information. Now, the issue with intuition is that it's not rooted in scientific inquiry or evidence. And so it's not really based in science. It's instead just based in feeling. Take, for example, this picture that you see on the slide. This is a picture of my great-grandmother, who I called Yaya Effie. My family's Greek, which is why I call my grandparents Yaya and Papu. And this is a picture of my great-grandmother, Yaya Effie, who had incredible intuition. She would give my mom a call whenever my younger brother or I were feeling sick when we were growing up. And I don't know how she always knew when we were sick, but sure enough, if I wasn't feeling well one day, Yaya Effie would be on the phone talking to my mom, saying kind of cryptic things like, "How's Kay feeling?" And so Yaya Effie just seemed to know, right? Now, that meant that when I grew up, I thought, or as I was growing up, I thought that Yaya Effie had incredible intuition. She just seemed to magically know when I wasn't feeling well, and she listened to her gut, and it was always right. However, in retrospect, as I became an adult, I realized that I was probably relying on what's called confirmation bias to form that opinion. You see, I tended to remember all of the times that Yaya Effie knew I was sick and called asking if I was okay. And I forgot all of the times that Yaya Effie called and I was feeling just fine, right? And so basically, confirmation bias is when you tend to remember and believe information that confirms what you think, while ignoring information that disproves what you might believe. And so in retrospect, Yaya Effie might have had some intuition, but it certainly wasn't rooted in science. And there were definitely many conversations that we had where I was feeling just fine. Okay, so now that we know what intuition is, we know that the main flaw with intuition is that it's not rooted in science in any way. Let's talk about another way that we tend to learn information. From authority figures. Authority figures are people who tend to be kind of in charge of something. And we've been conditioned from a very young age to accept new ideas if an authority figure says that they're true. Classic example of this in the field of psychology is shown in this picture right here. This is a picture of Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud is someone that you've probably heard about in your introduction to psych classes. Sigmund Freud was renowned as an authority figure in the field of psychology. And when he created a lot of his theories and ideas, people assumed that they were true because he was considered an authority on the topic. However, fast forward a few decades or so, and as people started to try to test the ideas that he created that were just testable in the first place, they realized that a lot of what Sigmund Freud believed was not actually accurate. And a lot of his theories are either not testable in the first place, or they've been falsified. They've been shown to be false. So just because an authority figure says something, whether it's Sigmund Freud, your professor, or any other authority figure, it does not mean that you should just accept those ideas and believe that they're true. Question things. Think critically about things. And this class will equip you with the tools that you need to research what authority figures say so that you can make an informed conclusion about if what's being said is actually true. All right, so let's go to the third way that we learn information, rationalism. Rationalism is exactly like what it sounds like. It's using logic and reasoning to acquire information. Now, this sounds pretty good at face value, right? If we're using logic and reasoning, we're probably going to create some pretty sound, good, valid conclusions. But the issue with rationalism is that if the logic is flawed, the conclusion is going to be flawed. Sometimes we don't always have sound logic. Take, for instance, this picture that you see on the slide. This is a picture of a swan. And you might have learned growing up that swans are white, right? So if you come across a bird and you see that it's white, you might assume it's a swan because swans are birds that are white. However, we likely know that there are many different types of birds that are white and not swans. So not all birds that are white are swans. We also know that not all swans are white. In fact, there are some black swans, not to be confused with the movie Black Swan. But long story short, if your logic is flawed, the conclusions that you draw will be flawed as well. Like for instance, if you assume all swans are white, when you come across a black swan, you might assume it's not a swan, when in reality it is. So the issue with rationalism is that for the information to be considered valid and accepted, the logic that goes into it first has to be valid as well. This brings us to our fourth way of knowing, which is empiricism. Empiricism is very important in our class, so I want you to really make sure that you understand what this means. Empiricism involves acquiring knowledge through observations and experience, and it is the fundamental characteristic of the scientific method. Again, empiricism is the fundamental characteristic of the scientific method. It's the idea that knowledge, what we know, is based on observation, what we see. And this is something this is something that we'll use and utilize in our course. In our class, we'll conduct a research project from start to finish, and part of that will be data collection. When we collect data, that's our observation. And then what we're going to do is analyze that data and derive conclusions based on that. This is systematic empiricism. And again, it's the fundamental characteristic of the scientific method. If you want another example of empiricism, think about Piaget. Piaget was a developmental psychologist who observed children playing on playgrounds. And from watching children play on playgrounds, Piaget was able to come up with a whole theory of cognitive development for children and proposed that children progress through different stages of development as they get older. Okay. Now, if empiricism is the fundamental characteristic of the scientific method, this means that our last way of learning or knowing information is the scientific method. The scientific method involves systematically collecting and evaluating evidence to test ideas and answer questions. Now, the key thing about this is that the scientific method only works with theories, ideas, and questions that are testable. Let's go back to Freud. A lot of Freud's theories are not actually testable. And so a lot of what Freud proposed was not actually scientific. Now, what we'll work with in this class is the scientific method, and we'll use this to collect data, to evaluate the evidence that we get, and then draw conclusions based on that. The issue with the scientific method, though, is that it tends to involve a lot of time and resources, so sometimes it's not always the easiest way to get information. But of the 5 different ways to gather information or reach knowledge in some capacity, the scientific method is most likely to produce valid and reliable data. So it's a really good approach. Now, this brings us to our summary. Here in this mini lecture, we learned about the 5 ways of knowing. Can you define and give an example of intuition, authority, rationalism, empiricism, and the scientific method? All right, this brings us to the end of this video, and I will see you all in the next one. All right.